Now we're going to move over to personality. So when it comes to personality, personality is a relatively permanent behavior, characteristics, or traits that you have. Especially by the time you reach adulthood, your personality remains fairly stable. You figured out who and what you are. Now, how we define personality is going to differ based on what psychological perspective is used. You have the humanistic perspective, which is very optimistic and pro-people. You have the trait perspective, which is more, you're born with certain personality traits and you get them from your parents, versus the sociocognitive perspective, which believes in reciprocal determination, where yes, the environment has effect on you, but you also affect your environment. This is unique, but there are some general traits that they tried to study to identify and label. So first, the humanistic perspective. The humanistic perspective focuses on growth and health. So how do you make a person their ideal self? Well, they believe in free will. This is the opposite of the behaviors theory. Remember, B.F. Skinner said there is no free will. There's only tabula rasa. The environment makes us who we are. The humanistic perspective says no, people have free will and they're more than just objects in their environment. We need to combine their real self, who they actually are, with their ideal self in a process called congruence. So growth, personal growth towards meeting your ideal self. They're going to emerge in response to the behaviors theory and Freud's psychoanalytic theory. They're going to say the behaviorists are too focused on the environment and not enough on free will, and that Freud was too focused on sex and aggression, and he just got weird. They're going to say focus on the social factors, how society affects the way that we develop cognitively. And the two founders are Abraham Maslow, who you already know from the Hierarchy of Needs, and Carl Rogers, who was a preacher before he turned into a therapist. So what do the humanistic branch, what do these people believe? Well, they believe in something called the self-concept. This is the core to your personality. Your self-concept is how you feel about yourself, with the end goal being real, accurate, honest self-recognition, including of your flaws, and acceptance of your natural self. And your self-concept is based in self-esteem. So your thoughts and feelings about yourself, but also your feelings of self-worth and feelings of control. Is there an external locus of control or an internal locus of control? Now, one of the things that leads to incongruence and leads your real self from being far away from your ideal self is relying on a self-serving bias. This is when you'll view yourself as good and everyone else as bad, meaning that your achievements are a result of your natural goodness and other people have put obstacles in your way. And so when you fail, it's not your fault, it's someone else's fault. So you're responsible for all the good stuff that happens in your life, but not responsible for all the bad stuff that happens in your life. An example of this would be the Tiger King, Joe Exotic. All of his achievements, that was because of him. He was like, I did that. All of his problems traced back to one source, and it wasn't him. It was Carol Baskin. He's like, the reason I'm in jail is because of Carol Baskin. Not because I tried to have her murdered, which is apparently a crime, but because of her. It's her fault and not anything that I had to do with that situation. Or y'all may have heard after Biden's inauguration, they were like wondering if they were going to commute Joe Exotic's prison sentence. And when they didn't, his Twitter posted, I was too innocent and too gay for the Trump administration to commute my sentence. And it's just like, okay, it's everyone else's fault. You had nothing to do with you being in jail right now. It's because you're too innocent and gay. Like, it's a really great example of self-serving bias. So y'all may remember with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is the end goal of that hierarchy. And all humans are born good, and we naturally move towards this highest level, but sometimes society gets in the way. Society knocks us down on this hierarchy. At the base, we have the most basic physical needs, food and water, clothing. Then we have safety needs, shelter. Most of us ping back and forth between the esteem and love and belonging tier of this hierarchy. It's very difficult to get to self-actualization, even though that's our end goal. but society gets in the way. Does society get in the way of shelter? Does it get in the way of basic needs? Sometimes. Like if there's a hurricane that wipes out your house, that's going to move you down on this hierarchy. But we aim for self-actualization. There's a lot of self in the humanistic perception: self-concept, self-esteem, self-serving bias, self-actualization. And self-actualization is just meeting one's full potential, becoming fully functional. Well, how do you become fully functional? Carl Rogers said that you needed a person-centered approach to therapy. All humans have potential for growth. Even if they're the worst human alive, they can get better. But in order to get better, they need a climate that has these three things: genuineness, meaning the client and the therapist have to be honest and sincere. The most important one is acceptance. This is the big one. Unconditional positive regard, meaning that the therapist will view the client with no judgment and unconditionally view them positively. So even if they tell them something really awful, they'll still maintain that unconditional positive regard to help them in their growth mindset. And then lastly, empathy. Empathy is when you understand what someone's going through because you've gone through it. Now, sympathy is when you haven't gone through it, but you're trying to understand how they feel. So even as a therapist, if you can't quite understand what a client is going through, you can still practice empathy and try to understand them, and acceptance, that unconditional positive regard. And that's going to help lead to congruence. Congruence is when your self-concept, your perceived self, molds together with your ideal self. This is called becoming fully functioning. You combine who you are today with who you want to be. Incongruence is caused by a lack of unconditional positive regard. So if you view yourself or others negatively, your perceived self gets further and further away from your ideal self. So there's no overlap there. They're not becoming one. This is when you become dysfunctional. This is the root, according to the humanistic perspective, the root of psychological issues. It's incongruence, lack of similarity between your perceived self and your ideal self. So we finished the humanistic perspective. Now we're going to move on to the trait perspective. First written about by Gordon Allport. Now, Gordon Allport believed that it's not your environment that determines your personality, but rather it's your genetics. So he rejects psychoanalysis and the behaviorist approach of environmental determinism, and instead says, no, you're born with certain personality traits, and then they emerge as you get older. That is the trait perspective. And traits are just stable personality characteristics. Personality characteristics that stay the same over time. So how did he determine what those traits were? Well, he made a bunch of surveys and self-reported inventories. Now, is that empirically based? No. The surveys can be very subjective. You can have a lot of different opinions getting in the way, and some people may not tell the full truth on a survey. Again, that's self-serving bias. So this trait perspective isn't necessarily scientifically based, but it's from his trait perspective that we're going to get inventory tests that eventually lead to empirically based science. Raymond Cattell is going to come up with two traits. The surface traits are the observable behaviors that result from your source traits. And there are 16 total personality factors that make up the source trait. So if y'all have ever heard of the Myers-Briggs inventory, like I'm an ENFJ, it has different factors in terms of extroversion versus introversion, intuition versus sensing, thinking versus perceiving. Okay, those are your personality factors that can combine to make different personality types. Okay, it's kind of like a horoscope. It's not really based in science. Now, the reason for that is because this type of personality inventory, where you try to respond true or false to these feelings or behaviors to identify traits, can fall victim to the Barnum effect, also known as the Fourier effect. This is when we tend to accept certain information as true, even if the information is super vague. So of course it's true because it's super vague. If it says something like, you like excitement in life. Well, yeah, like lots of people like excitement in life. What's your definition of exciting? I get excited when an Amazon package shows up at my front door. Is that the same for somebody else? Maybe not. Someone else may be like, I'm going to climb the face of a mountain. I'm like, no, thank you. That's not exciting to me. That's stupid. And so this can lead to that kind of problem that we have with horoscopes, where you read like, oh, it's Mercury in Gatorade, and so you're going to have bad date this week. Or you're going to have like this random event, and you're like, oh, it's so vaguely worded that you start, yeah, I said Gatorade. So you start putting in facts to prove it true. It's a bias and hindsight bias there. But from this early personality inventory test, we're eventually going to get a psychometric questionnaire that helps with identifying and diagnosing personality disorders. That is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is the only scientific, empirically based survey for personality because it's used as a diagnostic tool. When we did our Wellness Wednesday activity, you'll notice that this was not one of the personality tests available for you. That's because it is used for diagnoses. It's not open to the public. It's a Scantron test given by psychiatrists and other trained officials that they then run through the machine, and it gives them hits on what personality disorder you're showing traits of. Now, that personality disorder could be PTSD, it could be anxiety, it could be OCD, it could be antisocial personality disorder. It can be a number of things for them to be able to inventory so that they can pinpoint proper treatment. So this is not something that we just do in class. The other personality inventories y'all did take part in. So first off, the Minnesota Multiphasic. This contains hundreds of true-false statements. Sometimes they even repeat the questions because that's a mechanism for telling if the person has a self-serving bias. Are they malingering? Are they lying? Or are they actively trying to answer the questions to find out what diagnoses they get? So if you take this Scantron test and it determines that your answers don't match up with previous answers to the same question, they make you take it over again. This is the most widely used personality test because it can help us identify personality disorders and treatment. It's also used for screening purposes for some jobs, not like, oh, if you want to work at Chick-fil-A or become a teacher, but jobs where you need higher security clearance is where they would give these multiphasic inventories in order to identify personality traits that may become problematic. So this is empirically derived. It's based in science. It helps separate people that are neurotypical from people who might show symptoms of depression or anxiety or PTSD or sociopathy, all of those different personality traits that can show up in the DSM-5. The Myers-Briggs version is not meant for diagnosing, but the Myers-Briggs personality test has little scientific support. It tells you if you're introverted or extroverted, feeling or thinking, intuitive or sensing, judging or perceiving, and that can combine to 16 possible combinations. It's a lot like a horoscope. When you read your results, you're going to say, okay, that could be anybody. That's vague. But you may see some things that you're like, oh, heck yeah, that's definitely me, and that's only going to reinforce your trust in the personality test. Einstein's 2 dimensions of personality, base personality in temperaments that are inborn and unlearned that you get from your parents. They are genetically influenced. That could be extroversion or introversion. So are your parents outgoing or not outgoing? Neuroticism versus stability. Are you constantly changing or creative, chaotic, or are you consistent? And psychoticism versus socialization. So this was one of the tests that y'all did on the Wellness Wednesday. So if you're melancholic, you're going to be more prone to depression and anxiety, being more introverted and quiet. If you're choleric, you're going to be kind of fidgety and more impulsive. Sanguine, you're much more outgoing and carefree, like type B personality. Phlegmatic, you're more controlled, even-tempered, and kind of passive rather than filling a leadership role. Okay, again, this is not diagnosing any psychological differences. It's just trait-based personality tests. Now, Paul Costa and Robert McCrae came up with the big 5 personality traits. To remember it, remember the mnemonic device OCEAN. So are you open to experiences? Are you more active, Do you like excitement? This goes back to the Yerkes-Dodson arousal theory. Conscientiousness. Are you self-controlled? Do you have self-discipline? Do you think before you speak or act? Extroversion, obviously, how much do you interact with other people? Agreeableness, how do you get along with other people? And neuroticism, how likely is it for you to experience stress or anxiety or other negative emotions? According to Costa and McCrae, this becomes stable by the time you reach adulthood, but it is influenced by genetics from your parents and has been used to predict possible behavior. This is the most widely accepted model of the traits in the personality test outside of the Minnesota multiphasic, but again, doesn't help diagnose anything. So lastly, the social cognitive perspective. Y'all may remember that the behaviorists were super anti-cognition. B.F. Skinner was a big-time behaviorist. He believed in environmental determinism. What that means is the environment determines who you are. Tabula rasa, to the extreme. There's no free will. You're merely a product of your environment. And so there are three factors involved in environmental determinism. The person is impacted by the environment, and that impact shows up in their behavior. Albert Bandura, who is also a behaviorist, is going to say, no, that's a little bit too simplistic. He adds cognition to the idea of behaviorism, like the social learning theory or modeling and observational learning. Remember, he was the one who came up with the Bobo doll experiment, where he said it's not just behavior and modeling of that behavior, there's also cognition involved in it. And how we interpret or think about our environment affects how we behave. So he said that reciprocal determinism was more accurate than environmental determinism. Reciprocal determinism says that your environment has an effect on you, but you also affect your environment. It is a two-way street as opposed to environmental determinism, which is a one-way street. Okay, so like let's say your environment, your parents are one political party. Well, you're more likely to be that political party. But then you may decide, because you're a part of that political party, to go to a certain school over another. So you're reinforcing your behavior with your decisions, and your environment is changing based on those decisions. Again, reciprocal determinism is not just the environment having an effect on you, it's also you having an effect on your environment. So this counters the behavioral perspective, and it adds in cognition. This explains how the same environment can have different effects on different people. So like even if you have two siblings living in the same house, let's say it's an abusive household, it's an abusive environment. Well, one could go on to be a CEO of a company, whereas the other goes on to be in and out of jail. Same genetic code, same environment, same parents, and yet different effects. And so Albert Bandura says it's because of the cognitive aspect of reciprocal determinism. How they think or interpret or react to that environment affects their behavior, which further affects their environment, which further affects their person. Example of reciprocal determinism: my parents are liberal, I identify with my parents. That's environment. I therefore choose behavior, a more liberal college to attend. This makes me even more liberal. And attending this college, this new environment, I make students, my friends, more liberal. So that's you having an effect on your environment. I leave school for another environment, another job, working for liberal causes. So you can see how the environment affects that person and how that person then has an effect on their environment. Versus if you're a thrill seeker. Well, if you're a thrill seeker, then you're probably going to seek out people who want the same thing. So you're more likely to take bungee jumping lessons with a group. But you could also be pushing your friends to thrill seek. Take them bungee jumping with you. So your environment having an effect on you and you having an effect on your environment. And this can change based on the type of society that you live in, whether it's an individualistic society or a collectivistic society. Now, we've covered this before, so this is just a refresher. Individualistic societies tend to be more common in the West, whereas collectivistic societies tend to be more common in the East. This is the me versus we priority. Who's more important, the individual or the group? In these notes, if you look at this chart, it talks about the differences between individualistic and collectivistic societies. Independent versus interdependent. Me versus we. Self-efficacy is the belief that you are capable, that you are competent, your belief in your ability to succeed. Higher self-efficacy results in higher self-esteem. So how do you identify high or low self-efficacy? Well, those with a strong sense of self-efficacy view problems as challenges rather than threats, something to be mastered. They develop deeper interest in their activities. So even if that activity is difficult at first, they keep practicing and keep doing it. They form a stronger sense of commitment to their activities. So they're more likely to finish those activities. And then even if they encounter setbacks or disappointments, they tend to recover quickly and try again. Versus those with a weak sense of self-efficacy. They try to avoid challenging tasks because that threatens their identity and their idea of their efficacy. They believe that difficult tasks and situations are beyond their control, so they have an external locus of control. They hyper-focus on setbacks and personal failings and mistakes, and they are quick to lose their confidence in their personal abilities when they experience setbacks. So all this ties to internal versus external locus of control. Locus meaning location. Internal locus of control means that you believe you control your destiny. This is where achievement is going to be highest. I control my destiny is internal. External locus of control is they control my destiny. The idea that your fate is outside of your control, and instead of being based on hard work, it's based on luck. So whereas internal locus says hard work gets rewarded, therefore if I work hard, I can get promoted. External locus of control would say people get promotions not because they work hard or because they deserve the promotion, but because they know the right people. And that's going to have a much more negative effect on their own self-efficacy. Cognitive expectancy is higher in people with internal locus of control. Cognitive expectancy is the belief that your behavior will result in the desired outcome. That's going to be much higher in people with internal locus of control and high self-efficacy. If you have external locus of control, then you're more susceptible to learned helplessness. This is when you give up. If you are unable to avoid a negative situation, then eventually you give up trying to avoid the negative situation. Make sure that you look at this chart and the notes that I've put in that PDF at the end of the lecture series. We've only got a couple more slides left.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at the psychoanalytic theory. And from that, from Freud's basis that he provides with the psychoanalytic theory, we're going to move on to the psychodynamic theory. So it's very important to know that the psychoanalytic perspective focuses very heavily on unconscious forces. Those unconscious forces are going to be what determines our behavior, and thus, with their personality traits, are going to establish the perspective on how we develop our personality. It's not based on our environment so much as it's based on unconscious forces. Okay, those levels of consciousness include conscious awareness, where we're able to pull from our memory information that we haven't suppressed or repressed. We are consciously aware of it. This also involves our pre-consciousness, which is where it's not being held in our conscious mind currently. However, we could retrieve it with effort. So if we were to think about the first time that we went to school or our first birthday party, that would be easily retrievable. So it's in our pre-conscious stashed away, and we can bring it to our conscious mind. Our unconscious mind involves three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. These are vocabulary terms that we've already covered before. So the id covers our pleasure principle. Our superego covers our morality principle. And the ego itself is supposed to be the middle ground between those two. Now, Freud is going to focus very heavily on sex and aggression being behavior caused by our unconscious mind, and that we're not consciously aware of it because those memories, like memories of childbirth or memories of being potty trained by our parents, are going to be repressed. So we're not conscious if it's repressed, versus suppressed memories where we have feelings of guilt or shame that force us to avoid those uncomfortable or shameful memories. This also deals with instinctual energy, which he labeled as libido. So where do we focus most of our energy? Well, it's based on our unconscious mind guiding us towards those tasks or those goals. And then another way to interpret our unconscious mind, to access that information, is through the interpretation of things like dreams. So with the id, ego, and superego, the id is the pleasure principle. This is where we want immediate gratification of our impulses. So thinking of like the little devil on your shoulder, or conversely, Cookie Monster. He do be eating cookies, and he doesn't seem to have much control over his cookie habit. Our superego would be more in line with complying with authority. We know that we're not supposed to eat all of the cookies. Okay, so we tell ourselves, no, we have to step back. We have to not try to meet that need and not be in excess. So you don't want to be 100% id or 100% superego. Okay, you want to deal within the realm of reality. Okay, you need to satisfy the id to a certain level, but that level needs to be reasonable, or as I like to think of it, within the confines of the law. So you constantly have your id pulling you one way, and then your superego pulling you the other way. Your ego is merely the middle ground. We do develop some defense mechanisms in response to shameful or guilt-inducing feelings, things that we don't want to recall because it would make us too uncomfortable or it would threaten us, so it stays in our unconscious mind. Repression is where we block memories in order to prevent that anxiety or that shame or guilt feeling. So Freud explains the ages of 0 to age 2 as infantile amnesia, meaning where we're ages 0 to 2, we don't have any memory of our childhood. He says that's because of the trauma of being birthed and the stages of psychosexual development where we're being potty trained and things like that. So we repress those memories. We block them from our consciousness. Regression is when we actually go back in terms of our behavior. We revert to an earlier period in psychological development. So an example of this, we have a frustrating project or something going on at school, and that leads to us throwing tantrums and going on emotional mood swings, or even in an extreme case, turns to us going back to the childhood activity of bedwetting. Displacement is when we shift our urges, okay, our aggression towards someone, to someone or something else. So we move that aggression in our unconscious mind towards somebody who we could actually target rather than the person that it was supposed to actually be coming from or aimed towards. So a serial killer who targets women who look like his mother would be displaying displacement. He can't attack his mother for whatever reason, right? So he chooses to take out that aggression on somebody else, a replacement for his mother. So that aggression has been displaced onto somebody who had nothing to do with the situation. Projection is when we have an uncomfortable truth about ourselves, and so we project it or turn it on another person. So if a person who is cheating on their partner suspects their partner constantly of cheating on them, that would be an example of projection. It's actually them who's doing the behavior, but we repress those feelings about ourselves, like, oh no, I'm cheating on my significant other, or so on and so forth. And instead, we turn it on the partner. Okay, now they become the target where they must be doing something wrong because we can't deal with the uncomfortable feeling of we're doing something wrong. Denial is when we refuse to accept the reality of a situation. So we just keep going into this phase of, no, that didn't happen. No, that didn't happen. We ignore the situation and the facts of the situation, and instead we stick with that initial idea that we had. So, for instance, in terms of the news, you continue to see accusations of election fraud, people like the My Pillow guy who's just spending millions of dollars and going through all of these lawsuits so that he can say, oh, the election was stolen. That was back in 2020, and now we're in 2024, a whole new election cycle, and that's still a talking point that continues till this day. Reaction formation defense mechanism is when we take one of those urges that's unacceptable, that's shameful, that we're not supposed to have, and we go in the opposite direction. Okay, so polar opposite there. So a person who's a pyromaniac, someone who loves fire, might end up becoming a firefighter, okay, the complete opposite of being a pyromaniac. Rationalization is when we create an excuse for ourselves because we don't want to deal with the feelings of inadequacy or anxiety, especially for doing something wrong. So we have an unacceptable behavior like cheating on a test, right? And instead of looking internally and saying, I'm doing something wrong, I'm cheating on this quiz or test or assessment, instead we say, oh, well, it's okay because others do it, therefore me doing it isn't that bad. All of this to avoid actually looking at the issue at hand and your own behavior. You come up with excuses to let you continue doing that behavior. Sublimation is when we take our urges and we move it towards something of social value. So, for instance, if you were a pyromaniac and you became part of a bomb squad, right, that would be not reaction formation, but instead sublimation. You're taking something that's unacceptable, but you're finding somewhere where you can mold that into something of social use. So, like if you love fighting and hitting people, well, you don't have to just go to bars or get into random fights. You could actually join the UFC. You could become a wrestler. Any of those activities where violence or violent activity is actually condoned as a part of the activity rather than, say, random acts of violence. Freud also got a little bit weird with ages 0 through puberty when it came to psychosexual development. He claimed that there were 5 stages that everybody goes through. You have the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, and the genital stage, with a brief respite in the middle there, the latency stage. So from birth to about 1.5 years old, you are fixated on putting things in your mouth. Like he saw babies trying to like explore their world and just, putting random stuff on the floor in their mouths as, oh, this must be a stage of psychosexual development. So some characteristics of that could continue into adulthood, defining our personality, would be overeating. So if we're stuck at the oral stage and we're an overeater, well, it's because there's something that was going on at that time in our development and we got stuck. If you're a smoker or a sarcastic person, he also indicated that this went back to your oral stage in your psychosexual development where you're just fixated in that one stage and unable to progress. Anal stage, this has to deal with potty training. Okay, so if you have to potty train a child on, hey, do you got to go to the potty? You got to make sure that you actually know the steps and that you alert somebody to that rather than just going whenever, wherever, like a baby. So from ages 2 to 3 years old, which is typically when children are potty trained, they can either become anal retentive or anal expulsive. They're basically trying to fight back against that control that their parents are exerting over them by making them be potty trained. So an anal retentive person is somebody who personality-wise would have OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder. They might be excessively neat because they don't like mess. So basically not going to the bathroom in Freud's eyes. Anal expulsive is the opposite. They're uncontrollable. They won't stop and say, hey, I need to go to the bathroom. They're just like here right now. So they end up personality-wise being very messy or rebellious because, again, it's about that control. Both of these are about exerting control, okay, just in different ways. The phallic stage is what Freud is most commonly known for when it comes to his psychosexual development stages. From ages 3 to 6, he claims that boy children go through an Oedipus complex and girl children go through an Electra complex. So the Oedipus complex is where you have fear or hostility towards the male parent because you yourself are male. Therefore, you are going to be threatened by any other males in your environment. This means that you are in competition with the male parental figure for the attention and the affection of your mother. So that's what it means when it says the longing for the mother. However, since you're in competition with this older adult, okay, you start undergoing something called castration anxiety. Okay, basically exactly what it sounds like. You're afraid of being castrated. Eventually, that castration anxiety fades, and the male child starts identifying with the father as an ideal model or figure instead of as someone with whom they would need to compete. Obviously, it's called the Oedipus complex because of the Greco Roman story of Oedipus Rex, where he, through fate and some accidents, ends up marrying his own mother and killing his own father. Okay, so that's where Freud gets that whole title from. In contrast, the Electra complex, this is where female children are very, very salty about the fact that they were born with a vagina instead of with a penis. So they end up blaming their mother for that lack of male genitalia, thus culminating in something known as penis envy. Now, we are going to see some psychodynamic psychologists counter that, saying that's not actually about the genitalia, it's actually about a patriarchal society, but we'll get into that later with Karen Horney. After the phallic stage, thank God, you go into a brief respite where from ages 6 years old to puberty, you are not at all engaging in any sexual desires or psychosexual development. Instead, you're focusing on intellectual and social development. During this time, you do learn gender roles, like going into the psychodynamic theory of what can boys do, what can girls do, pink versus blue, monster trucks versus Barbie dolls, and sexual desires are repressed. So it's not conscious, it's unconscious, just like every one of these stages that we've talked about thus far. Then once the person hits puberty, that's when they go through the stage of psychosexual development where they have quote unquote normal sexual desires. Okay, so this is essentially the stage where boys will like girls, girls will like boys, and of course, with this coming out in the 30s and 40s, not so much of a focus outside of the heteronormative focus. Now, the psychodynamic perspective is going to say, okay, Freud, maybe chill out a little bit. You're making things really weird. So psychodynamic psychologists like Carl Jung and Karen Horney and Alfred Adler, they're going to move away from the whole everything is about sex and aggression, kind of like a cigar is sometimes just a cigar. So according to Carl Jung, in terms of personality, your unconscious mind has both the personal side of it and the collective side of it. Your personal side are your repressed thoughts and emotions. So you do still have repression as a defense mechanism, according to Carl Jung. However, there's also the collective unconscious, where you have universal or common to all human experiences that he calls archetypes. So archetypes, they could include like the ideal of the mother, where the mother is going to have a very formative impact on your development of personality and your development of romantic relationships. There's also the idea of animus and anima, where you could have the male archetype in women versus the female archetype in men. And then also, of course, the archetype of evil or the shadow archetype. Addition to this, he claims that you can either be an extrovert or an introvert, which what he means by this is where do you direct your energy? Is the source of your energy coming from you or from your environment? And then is the direction of your energy going towards you or towards others? So the libido, referring not just to sexual libido, but also just to energy and focus and motivation. He's also going to focus on individuation, aka the individual, the self. This, like we said before, is not going to be focused on sex and aggression. So it takes a side away from what Freud focuses on as the root to psychological disorders. Instead, Carl Jung claimed that you want to become fully aware of your true self by combining your personal unconscious and your collective unconscious into your conscious awareness rather than keeping it in the unconscious side of your mind. Your persona, or how you present yourself to the world, hides your true self. So that means that there is incongruence between your personal and your collective unconscious that culminates in your persona, or how you want people to think of you. When in reality, you are supposed to become fully aware of who you actually are rather than just hiding behind this persona of who you are. Erik Erikson, easy name to remember, is going to go even further away from Freud by saying maybe it's not sex and aggression and maybe it's not unconscious development so much as it is social influences throughout your life. He is going to articulate 8 different stages that all people allegedly go through, and there are going to be basic conflicts with that individual as they move through those stages. So at infancy, up until you're a year old, you go through the conflict of trust or mistrust. So with your parental units, if you have trust in them, you know that your basic needs like affection and food and water will be met. If you have mistrust, that means that you've probably been in a situation where your parents are not as dependable. And so that's going to be a bit of a conflict for you developmentally in your personality. Early childhood as a toddler, this is where you either become more independent, so autonomy, or this could be where you feel like you're not independent or capable or competent, so low self-efficacy, which then leads to shame or doubt. From ages 3 to 6, you deal with the conflict of initiative, meaning that you take the initiative to go and do things to lead, versus guilt, which could happen when you're unsuccessful with taking initiative, like you try to be the line leader but it doesn't work out, or when boundaries are overstepped. So obviously feeling guilty about that. By the time you go to elementary school, you're dealing with industry or your competence, whether or not you can do things and do things well, or inferiority, when you feel like your peers are ahead of you or that there's something maybe somehow wrong with you that's leading you to be less competent than your peers. In adolescence, teenage years, you go through identity versus confusion. So who are you? Okay, many teenagers go through this where they're trying to figure out which clique they're supposed to fit into, what music do they like, what are their basic values. So you can experiment with your identity in different roles, like if you go through your emo phase, or you go through your mean girls phase, something along those lines. That's where you're trying to figure out who you are as a person. By adulthood, like your dating years, ages 19 to 29, you have the conflict of intimacy versus isolation. Your end goal is love, so establishing relationships and intimacy with others, versus if you're not able to do that, that's when you get into the isolation side of that conflict. By middle age, you either deal with generativity or stagnation. So do you contribute to society? Do you contribute to your family? Or are you stagnant to the side, not really doing much of anything, and is life just passing you by? So this is where you can get into that midlife crisis. Oh, I need to, trade in my car for a better model, or I'm going to get a motorcycle, or plastic surgery, something along those lines. You feel like you're not generating anything, so you're just stuck in place. Once you become elderly, old age, ages 65 and older, this is where you're getting to the end of your life cycle. So when you look back at your life, you want to assess whether you had a meaningful life or whether you wasted your life. So integrity would be you looking back and saying, I had a good life. I did what I wanted to do. I raised my kids right. I didn't hurt anybody. Versus despair, where you feel like, oh, I didn't accomplish much of anything. I've wasted my life. And so now you're at the end of that life cycle and you're just looking back with regret. Karen Horney is going to go the opposite of Freud in some aspects, whereas Freud said that women have penis envy as a part of their Electra complex. She says that it's not a literal envy of male genitalia. Instead, it's metaphorical. It's what it represents in a patriarchal society. And what that represents is power. So it's not that they're envious of the actual appendage, it's that they're envious that they are second-class citizens in a patriarchal society. And she counters that men actually experience womb envy. Men envy the ability to create life. That's something that they cannot do. They cannot hold a zygote that develops into a fetus and then eventually birth it into a child. So whereas Freud is going to say that sex and aggression is the main driver of the formation of your personality, Karen Horney is going to say that culture, right, that's the main driver of your personality, like a patriarchal culture or society, and that issues in your childhood could cause disorders or neuroses in adulthood. So, for instance, if you were treated differently as a child because you were a girl and you're told you can't wear that or you can't play with those toys, right, then that may lead you to that metaphorical penis envy, where you're more so mad about all of the things that you're told you're not allowed to do rather than having body dysmorphia. Alfred Adler is going to say that we have a need for superiority, and so we can either develop a inferiority complex where we overcompensate, or we could have a drive that helps us reach our goals and find purpose. So our personality is more so driven by inferiority versus superiority. If we're met with feelings of inferiority, okay, we compensate and develop our own abilities. Okay, so for instance, if your older sibling went to Yale, you may compensate and end up going to Harvard instead. An inferiority complex would be if you overcompensate. So, for instance, if your brother went to Yale, and so then you go to Yale and you become the principal, or not the principal, the president of the student council, and you win all these awards and you get multiple degrees, all so that you can say, I am better than my brother. It's not about you or your personal goals or purpose. Instead, it's about your aggression against your brother, that feeling of inferiority that you haven't moved past. Which then leads us into the birth order theory, where Adler's going to say that the order in which you were born, are you the eldest child, the middle child, or the youngest child, that also can impact your personality. So, for instance, the eldest child might be forced to be more independent and be forced to take care of the younger siblings, so they become the parent almost in that relationship, versus the final child, the youngest child, maybe they're allowed to get away with murder, right? Because they're the baby in the family. And maybe the middle child feels a certain kind of way and has more of a risk of an inferiority complex because he's not the eldest, most responsible, so not the firstborn, but also not the baby of the family. And so he feels basically in the middle, lost between those two categories.